Confessions of a California Duginist, or Why I Am a Friend of Dugin and the Thinking of Alexander Dugin. Um, I am not uh, an proponent of the system of Dugin in the sense that Dugin speaks to the Russians. Um, in the St. George Hall, the magnificent hall where there was done communion between the guides, or as it were, the Waneks of the Russians, to the extent that, although Ivan Ilyich was mentioned by the Russian president, one could hear distinctly the voice also of Mr. Dugin, for instance, in the saying, which brings into public understanding at the direct level some issues which are otherwise passed off as mere viciousness of a ruling class that wants to hold back improvements which would be unquestionably a benefit to the population. But instead, we hear this question raised: what's all this talk about LGBTQ plus? What's all this talk about the superiority of the progressive liberal system? And why should it? Why is Biden sure that his system is more human than the system of which Putin is the? It's unimportant to say elected. He was elected, but somebody could say the elections were in some way rigged or something along those lines. So far as they know, probably they weren't, but you could say there was there wasn't this civil society culture which allowed for the opposition to Mr. Putin to have full say. This is partially true, but so far as I can understand the matter, I would reference to you Vladimir Brovkin, who has professor, Russian expatriate in America, who has testified before the U.S. Congress in the past during the period of the breakdown of the Soviet Union. What he says is that in Russia the situation is that the most powerful opposition to Putin comes from the old Communist Party, which wants to propose policies which are more anti-globalist Western policies, in the sense that they're socialist policies, that they care for their people rather than care for the Charles Sumner Maine calls it, the not by status but by contract. So the Western culture that fetishizes contract, because the contract was what overcame hereditary rulership by the hereditary aristocracy, so that the word aristocracy is not given simpliciter, where it means rule by the best, but rather it's modified to mean rule by hereditary stock, and hereditary breeded stock, which is only sort of assumed to be the best. Say the Bushes, for instance, is only assumed to be the best because the father was a president. The son is now assumed to be sufficiently educated in the right way to be a president, something like that, or this family is a good breeding stock. They've had generations of people that are in some way above average, and therefore it's not totally irrational, but it's just kind of fuzzy. But in this situation, since the time of the 1789 revolution in France, this has been put down as the wrong way to look at things, and in the bargain, aristocracy, rational rule as a whole was also put down, so that democracy, not democracy as this salus populi supremum lex, salus populi est supremum lex, that let the welfare of the public be the supreme rule of law, so that law is not law unless it's in the favor of the welfare of the public. This principle falls away during the French Revolution, and what comes in is the principle that something like I think in the a form that speaks to the most kind of mainstream thinking through, say, Malcolm Gladwell, this notion that the wisdom of crowds, that crowds get things right, and this is the kind of rationalization or rationale for a sort of sub-rational democracy. In other words, the only part that's rational is that somebody thinks it makes sense that crowds are the most intelligent rather than the most intelligent being the most intelligent. Somebody thinks it makes sense that crowds are the best rather than that the people that are the best are the best. That's not a simple conclusion, because the people that are de facto regarded as the best, Ivanka Trump, Donald Trump, may be complete idiots or spoiled brats, etc., etc. But the idea in the Socratic sense of Aristos are best, rule by the best, is not obviously false, even if it's de facto not exemplified by real rulers, except here and there by a few statesmen, so-called, that are a little bit better than the average politician that just wants to be reelected. Taken in this context of the West, the liberal West, Atlantic West, rich North Atlantic West, globalist West, representing this post-French Revolution system, which is in a way an irrational system, which, on the other hand, you could look at it through Milton Friedman. In my view, he never says anything that's obviously wrong. He's very intelligent, but probably, in other words, he makes a case where this contract is the best thing in the world. But if you take into account any kind of system of ideas, then you have to go away from the idea of the spontaneous order in Friedman, in Hayek. Hayek is better than Friedman intellectually. And then you have to think, well, maybe people that are doing philosophy in the traditional way, Heidegger. So is Heidegger a traditionalist? No. But Heidegger studies the whole tradition, and then he says, this is what makes sense after you've thoroughly and passionately studied the whole tradition. So he makes a break. And other people like that are sufficiently informed that we can take their views seriously, provided that they actually are saying something serious and not just people who are pedantic masters of just the mere quote-unquote facts of the tradition. This have memorized the tradition and therefore can show themselves as in command of the material. Once you have this kind of break, then the question of what reason stands for now is split a little bit. So The reason I'm a Duginist is not because I'm for Dugin's specific views about these specific points of why. Um, what I was going to say is not the mama and the papa, the father and the mother and the father, but parent one and parent two. That was part of the rhetoric used by Mr. Putin. Is obviously from Dugin, directly from Dugin, and other such statements. Not male and female, but male and female plus one other option, etc. These are things said at a direct level that not just the officials that were there in the somber and radically awesome hall there in the Kremlin, showing, there's you saw this colorful character, the Chechnyan president was there, and many other Russian luminaries. But it's not just that they could understand it, but I think any Russian listening could understand what was being said. So it's sort of like there's a play being performed in the West, and they try to say everyone who is a human being must do things this way. Parent one, parent two, male, female plus one, and if they don't do it that way, then there's this war of the human beings against those that aren't quite human, to bring them into line with what the human should be like. So in this sense, looking at that, when Dugin says there should be a pluralism and the Russians should be allowed to do free in the Russian sphere, free not to have to answer every needling question from their superiors about why are you not on board with all the views of Kristen Stewart, let's say. So in this sense, that's part of why I'm a Duginist, because Dugin gives expression to these ideas in a way which speaks to the intelligence. So also Dugin is a Heideggerian, so that's even more impressive to the intelligence. So taken from this point of view, the way I see it is, my teachers are many, but especially Plato, Leo Strauss, Martin Heidegger, Mishima, which is a poetic influence, or metaphoric. Mishima says he's not a poet, but he uses metaphor in a way which is thoughtful, and Dugin. So if you look at Heidegger, who gives the most to the intellect, the pure intellect? It's the Jesuits. So Heidegger has a Jesuit training, and he goes beyond the Jesuits. And then you could say Karl Rahner, somebody like that, who picks up, I won't say Rahner is a Heideggerian, because that's in a way would be an insult to him, because he's a Catholic. But in a certain sense, his book, which came out in, I think 1960, The Theological Investigations, is the most stunning meditation on what Heidegger means for the Catholic. So to say that we have something in that region giving to the intellect as a picture of rationality, it's in this sense that post the problems which appreciate and to an extent understands in Nietzsche the nihilist problem and the overcoming of nihilism. I think that this version of rationality, what rationality should mean, is a very strong one, and one has to wrestle with that. And that from within this horizon we can see that Dugin is saying things which meet the standard of rationality, which are rational. Um, so, although I speak as a Californian who, for instance, I think Kristen Stewart is personality-wise at the highest level of the Californians as representing California. But that doesn't mean that all her views as thought through are at the highest level. She's fairly young. And she, there's a rule in America that the president is supposed to be younger than 35, which is for a reason, because people learn things. So, but just from the point of view of raw personality, which is one of my major subjects, which, to say it pathetically, I've been unable to give voice to this subject because of the prejudice against it, because of the power of the view that the experimental sciences and repetition is the most serious thing, and that the facticity which comes directly from observation from individuals, which not everyone has. Anyone who has a special sensitivity to a subject matter, say music, say calculus, say algebra, whatever that subject matter is. Algebra could be also something which isn't just the simple algebra, but it also at the level of a Richard Feynman or a great physicist. Thinking about it that way, there's some people that have a vision which is sensitive to the peculiar nuances of different subject matter, different human pursuits. So in this sense, the fetishizing of experimental results makes it so that the search for the common welfare, which funds, or which at least at one time funded the sciences, blocks out the search for other things which are perhaps of greater importance to Dasein as Dasein, not just to an imaginary cosmos which is totally controlled by mechanism or by the mineral world rather than whenever you have this view, you have next to it this view of animism or of some kind of emergence out of the mere world of the physicists into the world of the chemists, into the biological world of organs, where things are happening that can't be predicted by even the best theories of the physicists, even the best theories of the organic chemists. And then eventually you'll say there must be something in the living material which outstrips the bare mass energy picture, etc., etc. So no matter how we go, we always end up getting pushed out into other human pursuits and other spheres where different people are sensitive to the material or not. But in any case, the subject matter of personality, which I think is essential to the human being, is one of those which has been marginalized and pushed out, to use the current style of rhetoric in the progressive left, so that this is not a voice which is being heard and included, to use this Kamala Harris type of way of speaking. So that I think that a large personality in California is going to, when mature and when well informed, do something different than the great personality produced by the Russian sphere is an epistemic peer and a peer in other ways, but it would in a certain way be incomparable. So in this way, it's definitely preferable to have different, this so-called pluralism, world pluralism. So Francis Fukuyama says there should be pluralism within the country in order so that the oligarchs don't come to power. There's all these warring factions which keep anyone from being in power in a certain sense. I think actually this is Zizek's thesis, nobody is in power. And the reason nobody is in power is because there's no 1X, there's no coordination of Dugin and Putin into one entity, the warrior and the keeper of the transcendence into one entity, because the contract first rules, because the bastardized form of Marxism called libertarianism is in control. In other words, the attack on so-called, where all the influence, everybody just hears about this attack on the so-called monopoly capitalism, which in weaker and more simple-minded forms you find with the progressive left. But if you consider that the cultures are not just cultures, but let's just use the word civilization just as a bare, red letter term under which things can follow. If you speak of the civilizations, as Mr. Putin used the word civilization, clearly taking up the Dugin guidance, one sees that this is inadequate to say this is the solution for the people within our civilization so that we won't fight one another, is to have everybody totally powerless, and the only thing that's in power is the so-called, how does Hayek put it, the spontaneous ordering that comes from the standard example is the beach. There's not strict rules on the beach. People put up an umbrella, they put down a towel on the sand where they want, they sit where they want. And this, if you listen to Milton Friedman, but again, it's very intelligent what he's saying, but he will tell you that the state or a centralized planning cannot have all the information. So what's the problem here is that, okay, if you want to do things on the basis of information, on the basis of a certain idea of that entrepreneurial behavior is what's in the service of the welfare of your people, if you want to do things that way, it's not obviously wrong. It may be very attractive, it may be a good thing, but it leads to certain consequences. One of those consequences is a kind of pleasure-seeking mentality. What's the what are the laws that permit the most possible pleasure-seeking for, at least for the class of people who are powerful enough to do nothing but pursue various forms of pleasure, so such as Kristen Stewart. And then you see that this is a very specific tack or a very specific way of pointing the ship of state. So if you're Captain Cook out in the deep ocean trying to find an island, and you have intuition that there's an island in a certain way, it's reasonable. But then if you're in the Russian sphere, in the Chinese sphere, it's going to appear differently where you want to set your ship of state. And these calculations based on the most power for the entrepreneur don't necessarily make sense in the Russian sphere, because that's not necessarily the most, the thing they rejoice in most, the most gratifying thing under the culture as it is now. And the seduction towards that by Fukuyama, who, by the way, was in Ukraine teaching lessons on how to become more American, even though he criticizes America quite a bit for being a juristocracy and for being weighed down in all these legalistic problems which prevent things from getting done. But the reason I favor Dugin over Zizek is more complicated than that in a way, but I would say de facto, in the crudest sense, you could simply say Zizek favors the status quo, even though he constantly says the status quo might be something terrible. It might be getting into this swamp situation of sort of restless movement at the subatomic level, but no sort of a circling in an arbitrary movement at the level of political quote-unquote progress. So that Zizek actually says we might be going into a total stagnation of a kind where your foot is stuck in the mud, and you're kind of even if you're pulled out, you'll probably lose your shoe. And so why is Zizek still in favor of this system that he knows that he presents as unable to rescue us? So why doesn't he actually, even if he doesn't want, he has some health problems, okay, but even if he doesn't want to have extemporaneous exchange with Mr. Dugan, why not have a written exchange? Why not have some exchange? The reason is because Zizek takes this Biden position of the total moral high ground, and then he says, I will not touch Mr. Dugan with a 10-foot pole because he's a sinister agent of the wicked forces, and I know this type of person, and they're the type of person that thinks I want nothing but the freedom to commit heinous crimes and rape and so on, and I had that freedom under the communist system and I don't have it now, so I'm angry. So this is basically the attitude Zizek, who up until fairly recently didn't even mention the name of Dugan, long after it was appropriate, but it then not so long ago said Dugan the philosopher god, meaning Dugan is this one who has pushed us into this life or death terroristic situation of the Ukraine war through his philosophizing. But the question is it really that Dugan is simply saying things that are sinister, simply manipulating, simply corrupt, or actually, as I believe, if we're really rational and we think about it honestly, this position corresponds to the most rational position, the pluralist position, which says don't follow this Carl Schmitt dichotomy, the friend and the enemy, where the friend is the universal position of Kamala Harris and Joseph Biden, and the enemy is the position of the wicked, to use this oft-repeated phrase, the perpetrator of the unprovoked invasion of the Ukraine. But I think Zizek knows too much to really... can Zizek, let's make this the challenge, can Zizek actually say that the invasion of the Ukraine was unprovoked? So I would make that a challenge to Mr. Zizek, and a challenge to his conscience. And we can see now Zizek has proposed idea. It's a true idea. There's such a thing as a philosopher god. I remember the remarks of Heidegger from his Der Spiegel interview.